In a kingdom bordered by ancient forests and misty mountains, where the line between stories and reality often blurred, there lived a young woman named Elara. Unlike the other villagers who feared the darkness and what might lurk within it, Elara had always been drawn to the mysteries of the night. Perhaps it was because she had been born under a blood moon, or perhaps it was simply her curious nature, but Elara found beauty where others saw only danger. On the eve of her 21st birthday, as Elara walked along the edge of the forest gathering herbs for her grandmother's remedies, she spotted something unusual, a pale blue flower that seemed to glow in the fading light. She had walked this path countless times, but had never seen such a bloom before. As she reached to touch its delicate petals, the flower released a cloud of luminescent pollen that danced around her fingertips. "Beautiful things always come with a price," came a voice from behind the trees. Elara spun around to find an elegantly dressed old woman watching her. The woman's silver hair was woven with flowers and vines, and her eyes held the wisdom of centuries. "Who are you?" Elara asked, not frightened but intrigued. "I am the keeper of the Midnight Garden," the woman replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "And you, my dear, have been invited." The old woman extended a hand holding a small envelope sealed with wax the same color as the glowing flower. "Come to the heart of the forest when the moon is highest tomorrow night. Follow the blue flowers, they will show you the way." Before Elara could ask any more questions, the woman vanished as if she had been made of the forest mist. That night, Elara could think of nothing but the invitation. Her grandmother, with whom she lived in a small cottage at the edge of the village, warned her against venturing into the forest after dark. "The forest changes at night," her grandmother said, her voice trembling slightly. "The paths shift, and those who enter rarely return unchanged. If they return at all." But Elara had always trusted her instincts, and something about the invitation called to her soul. After her grandmother had gone to sleep, she opened the envelope to find a card with elegant script that simply read, "The Midnight Garden opens only to those who seek beauty in darkness. Come alone." The following night, beneath a full moon that hung heavy in the sky, Elara slipped out of the cottage. The forest, usually a wall of impenetrable shadow, was dotted with the same glowing blue flowers she had seen earlier. They formed a clear path, beckoning her deeper into the woods. As she followed the flowers, the forest around her transformed. The trees grew taller, their branches reaching toward the sky like grasping fingers. The usual night sounds, hooting owls and rustling leaves, faded away, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by whispers that seemed to come from the trees themselves. "Turn back," they seemed to say. "This path is not for mortals." But Elara pressed on, her curiosity stronger than her fear. After what felt like hours but could have been minutes, for time moved strangely in the forest at night, she came to a clearing bathed in moonlight. In the center of the clearing stood a wrought iron gate covered in intricate designs of flowers and vines. Beyond it lay the most beautiful garden Elara had ever seen. Flowers of every color and shape grew in abundance, some familiar, others so strange and exotic that they could not possibly be of this world. Fountains burbled with water that shimmered like liquid silver, and lanterns hung from trees, their light dancing across the scene like fireflies. And there, pruning roses that bloomed black as midnight, was the old woman. "You came," she said, looking up with those ancient eyes. "Few are brave enough to accept my invitation." "What is this place?" Elara asked, stepping through the gate that swung open at her touch. "A sanctuary of sorts," the woman replied. "A place where beauty and darkness dance together. A place where stories are born." As Elara walked through the garden, she noticed that each section seemed to hold different flora, some vibrant and lush, others withered and decaying. And in each section, there were statues of people, their faces frozen in expressions ranging from wonder to terror. "Who are they?" Elara asked, gesturing to the statues. The old woman smiled. "Previous guests. Some found what they were looking for, others found what they feared most." As the night deepened, the old woman, who introduced herself as Morana, showed Elara the wonders of the garden. There were flowers that sang when touched, trees that bore fruit that glowed like jewels, and a pool at the center that, Morana claimed, showed reflections of other worlds. But as beautiful as everything was, Elara couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whispers had followed her into the garden, growing more urgent with each passing hour. And she noticed other things, how the flowers seemed to turn toward her as if watching her movements, how the fruit on the trees resembled hearts more than apples, how some of the statues had tears of real water flowing down their stone cheeks. "What happens at midnight?" Elara finally asked, remembering that this was, after all, the midnight garden. Morana's smile widened. "Ah, curious and perceptive. A rare combination." She checked an ancient pocket watch. "It's almost time. You'll see soon enough." As the watch's hands aligned at midnight, the garden began to transform. The beautiful flowers turned to faces, human faces, their mouths opening in silent screams. The trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches becoming arms reaching for Elara. And the pool at the center began to bubble with a thick, red liquid that smelled unmistakably like blood. "What is happening?" Elara gasped, backing away from Morana, who now stood taller, her elegant clothes replaced by a gown made of what looked like flayed skin, her silver hair writhing like snakes. "The midnight garden reveals its true nature at the witching hour," Morana said, her voice no longer gentle but harsh and grating. "Just as I reveal mine." Elara turned to run, but the gate had vanished. The garden had become a nightmare landscape of horror and suffering. The statues, she now realized, were not statues at all, but people trapped in a moment of terror, preserved for eternity. "You can't leave," Morana said, approaching Elara with predatory grace. "No one ever leaves the midnight garden. But don't worry, you'll make a beautiful addition to my collection." Elara's mind raced. She remembered the stories her grandmother had told her, tales of forest witches and the old magic. Deals and bargains. Rules that even the darkest creatures had to follow. "I challenge you," Elara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "A game or a task? If I win, I go free." Morana stopped, her head tilting like a curious bird. "Interesting. It's been centuries since anyone has challenged me." She considered for a moment. "Very well. The task is simple: find something in my garden that is truly alive. Not preserved, not transformed, but living and growing of its own accord. Do this before dawn, and you may leave." The task seemed impossible. Everything in the garden was tainted by Morana's dark magic. The flowers fed on fear, the trees grew from sorrow, and even the air itself seemed heavy with despair. Elara wandered through the nightmarish landscape, her hope diminishing with each passing hour. She tried to communicate with the trapped souls, but they could only watch her with terrified eyes, unable to speak or move. She examined every flower, every tree, every creature that flitted through the shadows, but all were corruptions of life rather than life itself. As the eastern sky began to lighten, Elara sank to her knees in defeat. She had failed. She would join the collection of the damned, another trinket in Morana's twisted garden. But as she pressed her hands to the ground in despair, she felt something, a faint pulse beneath the soil. Digging frantically, she uncovered a small, ordinary seed. It hadn't sprouted, hadn't been corrupted by the garden's magic. It simply was, containing within it all the potential for life. As dawn broke, Elara presented the seed to Morana, who had been watching her search with amusement. "This is what is truly alive in your garden," Elara said. "It hasn't been touched by your magic. It's dormant but filled with life waiting to be born." Morana's face contorted with rage, then settled into a cold mask. "Clever girl. Too clever, perhaps. Yes, you have found the one thing in my garden that I cannot corrupt: possibility. The potential for life not yet formed." She stepped aside, and the gate reappeared. "You may go." But as Elara rushed toward freedom, Morana called after her. "But know this, you carry a piece of the midnight garden with you now. It has tasted your fear, your wonder, your very essence. And one day, it will call you back." Elara emerged from the forest as the sun rose fully above the horizon. Her grandmother was waiting at the edge of the trees, having noticed her absence during the night. "You went to the garden," her grandmother said. It wasn't a question. "How did you know?" Elara asked. Her grandmother pushed back her sleeve to reveal a small tattoo of a blue flower, the same one that had led Elara into the forest. "Because I escaped it too, once. And so did my mother before me. She said it would call me back," Elara whispered. "And it will," her grandmother nodded. "The garden always calls back those who have seen its true nature. But now you know what it is, and knowledge is power." In the months that followed, Elara studied everything she could about the old magic, about bargains and deals with creatures of darkness. She learned from her grandmother all the protective wards and spells that had kept her safe over the years. But sometimes, in her dreams, she still walked through the midnight garden. And sometimes, in the corner of her eye, she thought she saw blue flowers growing where none had been before. She kept the seed she had found, planted in a small pot on her windowsill. It never sprouted, but she watered it each day, nonetheless. A reminder of what waited in the forest. A reminder that even in the darkest places, the potential for true life could be found. And on nights when the moon was full, Elara would sit by her window and watch the forest edge, knowing that somewhere beyond the trees, Morana was waiting, tending her garden of horrors, perhaps already planning how to reclaim the one who got away. But Elara wasn't afraid anymore. After all, she had made a bargain with a creature of nightmare and won. And in the world of the old magic, that meant something. It meant she was ready for when the midnight garden called her back. For in the world of fairy tales and nightmares, endings are rarely truly the end.